Another time. In the age of wonder. Another world. Another time. His land was green and good.
Hello! One of my patrons asked me a really interesting question over on Patreon, and I thought I'd redo and share some of my answers. So the question was, what are some of the things to look out for when you move from a traditional RPG to more of a story game? There's no quick and easy way to answer this because it's very hard to define what actually is a traditional game and what actually is a story game, and wars have been fought over less. Many story games have a much looser structure, much less in the way of rules, and they're much more open even than traditional role-playing is to the characters deciding what they do and determining the story, and in general it's a rule that they're much more widely open, but then there's always outliers that are massively restrictive trash. Generally speaking though, it's all about a difference in emphasis. So let's delve into some games theory. Okay, there's a theory about role-playing game design and interpretation called GNS theory, with the GNS standing for game, narrative and simulation, and the idea is that games fit to varying degrees into each of these categories. There's been lots of discussion and argument over this over the years, lots of people dismiss it as trash. Personally, I find it quite useful as a designer to kind of understand where I'm aiming for or to interpret games that I like. So here's what it kind of looks like with a bit of eye candy in case you get bored. Very few things are entirely down one prong on this triangle of values. Most games are somewhere in between, but you can think of things that exemplify each of these three prongs. So if something is very much focused on the game, the rules of the game, if the stories and fun emerge from the rules, and it's not trying to represent something in reality, and it's not trying to tell a story, then it's very much a game. So something like the card game Snap, for example, might be way up on the game axis, or poker might be way up on the game axis. You know, the stories that emerge from these kind of games are stories about how you play the game. You know, oh, you remember that time when I just beat you putting that card down? That was fun. Or that time I bluffed you out, or that sort of thing. The simulationist line is about how that game tries to represent reality. So if you look to computer games for a change, if you consider flight simulators, I mean obviously the thing's in the name, it's very much simulationist. It's trying to represent reality. Some of these games have you run commercial, these flight simulator games have you run commercial flights or recreate historic journeys or something, and that would push it slightly more towards the narrativist side. But a simulation is trying to represent reality. Moving back to tabletop, simulationist type games, the stories in those try to emerge from placing you very strongly in that world. Now this category gets a bit confused with the narrativist category sometimes, because what you're trying to simulate may not necessarily be reality. But a simulationist oriented RPG might be something like Traveller, where it's very focused on at least what was considered to be hard science in the 70s, and has a lot of maths for designing ships and so on. So that would be more of a simulationist effort. The narrativist prong, that's where story very much comes in. So is the game focused on the story that you're creating, or does the story emerge from the rules? Does it emerge from what you do as you play, or does the story lead the charge? Is that what's the focus of the entire game? So a very narrativist type game might be like the card game Once Upon a Time, for example. When it comes to tabletop games, I think the first kind of examples of really story-oriented games were probably Over the Edge and Feng Shui. Feng Shui being a game that's about kung fu cinema, basically, and tries to recreate that over-the-top, stupendous Jackie Chan or whatever style action in it, and has rules that support that. So narrativism has aspects of genre emulation, but also it places the story, the rule of cool for whatever type of game that you're playing, very much at the apex. Okay, so here's what the archetypical RPG for everyone, D&D, might look like laid out on this chart. It's much more emphasised on the game, it's much more on the rules. The rules might try to approximate reality, but it's in a very rough way. And while there are stories in the games, you know, you're playing through a story in your module or your dungeon, narrative isn't the focus. Narrative emerges from play. It's not necessarily part of it right from the start. Compare and contrast that to the most well-known story game, Fate. There's still aspects of game there, you still roll dice to do things, there's still luck of the draw there. It still simulates to an extent, because characters of different skill levels will have different levels of capability, but narrative is the driving force. Everything from the way characters meet during character creation and have interwoven backgrounds, to the descriptive traits that it uses, right up to the way that players can spend fate points to intervene with the narrative and introduce the story elements and so on, acting as mini GMs in a way. I think that's the definitive difference between traditional games and story games for me. In a traditional game, the dice drive the action. You know, you roll a dice, see what happens, and you react to it. Whereas in a story game, the narrative drives the action. What's appropriate and right to the situation tends to be what happens, and the rules, the whole scaffold of the game, the expectations of the players, the things that they can do, is all set up to make that kind of story play out. So in a traditional game, you might face down the final boss, the evil sorcerer or whatever, and you know he's mid soliloquy, and you decide to make your attack, and you roll a critical hit and instantly kill him or whatever, and that becomes a funny, amusing story that's emerged from what you've rolled and what's happened during play from the dice. You know, it all emerges from that, but it might be a little bit dissatisfying to the games master, because maybe they had this whole soliloquy written out, they were looking forward to this big final confrontation, had all this planned out or whatever, and it didn't go according to plan. But what drove the action and what made the amusing player anecdote was what happened with the dice. In a story game, he might have immunity while he's making his soliloquy or whatever, you know, and the rules and so on would be set up to support this big out and out final battle with all kinds of dramatic stuff going on, encourage the players to be innovative and do stuff, and the emphasis there would be on the story first and then the rules supporting that, rather than perhaps the other way around. There's no value judgment here. Each way of approaching a game has its own strengths, has its own weaknesses. I fall somewhere in the middle on this. I like story play elements, I like traditional play elements, I like a certain verisimilitude in my games, which means I like simulation. So I'm all over the place. I don't really fit into any camp, but there is quite a lot of hostility between camps in gaming, both designers and players, between these things. But really, I mean, going into it, generically, all I can say is you need to be mindful of where the emphasis of the game is, and if you're moving from a traditional game to a story game, the big difference is the attention moves away from the dice and the stats and so on and onto the story. There are some fairly serious pitfalls in story games that I feel like people often don't talk about, and I'm not sure that's such a good idea. I think we should be aware of problems without trying to put people off. Now, I think most of us are aware of issues with traditional games, in that there's often a lot of record keeping, a lot of mathematics and so on, and that can be off-putting to a lot of people. But what doesn't seem to be recognised quite as much is that there are aspects to story games that are also off-putting to people. If you're not a particularly good role player, but you're good at crunching numbers and you enjoy crunching numbers and you like making powerful builds and so on in traditional games, you can generally feel that you come out with a useful character and you contribute something to the game. In the excess, that becomes rules lawyering and munchkinism, but at a lower level, it just means you're a useful player and you're getting something out of the game in your own way by crunching the numbers, by doing powerful character builds, or whatever the case might be. Messing with the system, finding something in the mathematics and the interplay of rules that you enjoy. That isn't really available in story games to people. If some of your players aren't very good role players, aren't massively creative, aren't able to express themselves very well, they can have a really frustrating time in story games, which in many cases rely on descriptions and an awareness of narrative and so on that traditional games don't have, and that can be a huge pitfall and mean that you get someone who just isn't going to enjoy their time at the table. Should I say this? Yes. Okay. There's a lot of gamers who are somewhere on the autistic spectrum, and they will often find story games a lot more difficult. Now, I've played with people on the spectrum and they've gotten a lot out of traditional games. It has aided and helped their social skills, in my opinion, because it provides a structure for them to socialise and so on in. But I don't think a story game is so suited to those people, because it just relies too much on those aspects. Of course, everyone's individual, your mileage may vary, you know your group better than I do, but it's something to worry about. The other really big thing about story games is that they heavily favour an improvisational style of GMing. So if you're not an improviser, if you can't think on your feet, then story games are probably going to be less fun for you. This is lessened to a degree by the fact that most story games, it's very easy mechanically to come up with things on the fly. Okay, these baddies have 3 health and they're +3 to everything they do. Okay, let's go. That kind of thing is much easier to do in story games than it is in a traditional game. Unless you've done a hell of a lot of prep work and you have monsters of every level all there right ready to go, and you know all the rules backwards and forwards, the challenge ratings and all the rest of it. It's much harder to improvise and just throw things at people in a traditional game. Way harder. In a story game, it's a lot easier because the system tends to be a lot simpler, and you can honestly just kind of wing it and make shit up on the fly as you go, if you want. And that kind of game encourages that. But even so, if you're not an improvisational GM, it's still difficult, and this is made a lot harder by the story games that allow the players around the table to have narrative buy-in, which means through some kind of token or intervention or some character abilities or whatever, they can abruptly introduce or change something about the story. Of course, you're the games master, you don't have to go along with it, but if you don't, you kind of defeat the object of the game and so on. So you really need to be able to improvise when someone introduces a new element into your game and adjust your story around that and make it work. So if you're not an improvisational GM, I'd say if you're not an experienced GM, it can be incredibly difficult to handle and deal with story games. There's a few other issues that can pop up, but those are the really major ones, and hopefully an understanding of how and why these games work differently. So good luck with your games. Zang.
Grim gave a big yawn and settled down to sleep. And of course, when Grim goes to sleep, all of his friends go to sleep too. The people on the internet were just text on a screen, the collectibles were just cheap plastic tat, and the books were just elaborate sandwiches made of wood and paper. Even Grim himself, once he was asleep, was just an old saggy goth twat, baggy and a bit loose at the seams, and nobody loved him.